How's it going, everyone? David from dodmedia. There's really only two ways of doing a time-lapse, right? There's interval shots that uses stills that you process and turn into a motion JPEG sequence or that kind of thing. And then there's actually just filming video and speeding it up and adding motion blur in post. Those are the only two ways, right? Not exactly. This is the lesser known method for time-lapses. So what if we could take the two best things about those methods? Method one, you have the long exposure, allows for good motion blur to happen in your shot. And method two, you're filming, so you don't have to do any assembly of image sequences later on in post. You don't have to process any RAWs. You can just smack a LUT and color grade it because it's a video file. Well, as it happens on the Sony cameras, on the Panasonic cameras as well, on the Lumix, I'm not sure about the Canon cameras, however, you can actually drop your shutter speed well below the 180-degree rule. What I mean by that is that typically the 180-degree rule is that you want to have twice the shutter speed of the frame rate that you're shooting at. So if I'm shooting at 24 frames a second, I would want around 1/48 of a shutter speed, so 1/50 is what's available on this camera. However, you can go much, much lower than 1/50 of a second. In fact, you can go all the way down to 1/4 of a second. 1/4 of a second exposure time. Now obviously 1/4 of a second exposure time doesn't fit into 24 frames a second playback. So what we're actually going to do is film with that really slow shutter speed and then speed up that video file. Smack an ND filter on the lens because the amount of light you're going to be getting in at 1/4 of a second is going to be insane. But by doing that, you're actually going to be getting the best of both worlds because you're going to be getting the motion blur that you would get from the stills technique, and you're going to be getting that easy file to use that you get with the video file technique. So right here I've got the A7 III with the Sigma 35mm lens on it, and it's on the motion time-lapse slider, and what I'm doing is filming. And you can see that I'm filming at 1/4 of a second. I'm at f2, the lowest ISO possible. I've got some ducks who come over to say hello and now they're leaving. And it's just moving along at the minimum speed on this slider in a constant movement. So it's not doing the stop-start of a time-lapse. It's just sliding as a motion slide because that's what I'm using for video. And you can see the water there in that frame is not smooth. It's kind of stuttering past because that's the shutter speed forcing that exposure to take that long, so it kind of bleeds over a number of frames. In fact, if you take 1/4 of a second, 24 of those is 6 frames because 6 is 1/4 of 24. So each frame here is actually going to expose over 6 frames of your footage. Which, I mean, covering 6 of those frames is a problem if you're playing this back at normal speed. But because we're going to be speeding it up, it's not going to be a problem. We're actually going to be cutting out 6 of those frames or 5 of those frames and only using the one good frame that we want to use.
A goose.
Hey there, buddy. You're not going to attack me, are you? Can't trust him. So let's take these files. So let's take these files and put them in Premiere Pro, and I'll show you what to do with them once you have recorded them. Alright, I've transferred all my video files onto the hard drive, I brought them into Premiere Pro, I've had a quick shave, well done if you noticed, and now it's basically ready to go. Create a sequence for your clip and then hit Command or Control R to bring up the speed settings. Alternatively, you can also right click and come up to speed duration, and it'll open up that same window. Now remember I said that at 1/4 of a second, it's going to take 6 frames to show that exposure, which means that you're going to have 1 frame where it's actually showing a new exposure and 5 frames after that where it's just the same thing, it's the same image printed on until it gets to the 7th frame where a new exposure comes in. If I just escape this without changing any speed settings, you can see that. Let me scrub through where something happens. Here, people walk by, cool. So if I hit the arrow once to skip 1 frame, they walk into the way of the sun. But now if I hit it 5 more times, it's just going to be the same frame for 5 frames. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nothing happens. And then on the 7th one, new frame. And then 5 more after that will be the same thing again. So basically, if we want to get a 1-to-1 readout where we're only getting those fresh frames instead of having any of those copies, we need to accelerate it by 600% because we want to get it 6 times faster, so it's only using 1 in 6 frames. So hit Command or Control R, change that to 600%. And now if I play this back, it is buttery smooth. Look at that. There's natural motion blur, organic motion blur, and the movement is beautiful and smooth. There are no repeated frames. It's a time lapse like you would get if you're doing a photo time lapse, because those people have blur in them. They have organic blur in the picture. It's not a post-production thing. By the way, you may want to create some proxy files for these, because playing back 4K H.264 files at 600%, most computers are going to struggle with that. If you don't know how to make proxy files, leave a comment in the comment section. I will make a tutorial on it. Okay, so one-to-one playback looks really nice on that. But what about if, for example, this traffic shot, if I set this to 600%, it's not quite fast enough. I'm not getting those lines that I want to see in those headlights, in those taillights. I want to get more of a light drag on those. So let's say instead of, 1-to-1, I want this to be a bit faster. I want it to be 4 times faster than it currently is. So that would be 24 times faster than real life, because 4 times 600% is 2,400%, 24 times. So if I go back into Command or Control R and change this to 2,400 and play this back, well, now it looks good, but you lose a bit of that organic motion blur feel, because everything's happening so much faster that you're kind of moving away from that 180 degree rule again. It's looking a little bit more like a normal video time-lapse. But if you go back into your speed settings, and down here where it says time interpolation, you change from frame sampling to frame blending, what's going to happen is that all of those frames that you've squished in by speeding it up by 4 times are not just going to be thrown away and not shown. They're actually going to be blended and overlaid with each other to create a motion blur. Now, people do this using video time-lapse, the traditional way when you're shooting at a faster shutter speed, at a 1/50th of a second shutter speed. And when they apply the frame blending, it looks kind of good, but it looks very synthetic, because each frame is sharp. So when they're overlaying each frame, it's a sharp image instead of being a nice solid blur. So it just it looks like a really bad motion blur in After Effects if you haven't adjusted how many samples per second there are. However, because we already have organic motion blur in each of these frames, when you're blending them together, you're actually going to extend that motion blur instead of showing like several images stacked on top of each other to create a motion blur. It's basically going to stretch out those light trails that you already have in there, which is going to look amazing. So hit OK, and then you're going to need to render it out, because the frame blending needs to be rendered to actually see what it's giving you. Otherwise, you'll have to wait until export to actually see what you're getting. And now you can see that those light trails are way longer than 1/4 of a second. In fact, because we're going 4 times faster, we now have a 1 second exposure on these frames, or at least a representative 1 second exposure on these frames. So those light trails are as if the shutter was open for 1 second, and you're getting that motion blur in there. All right, let's play this back and see what it gives. So by shooting at a low shutter speed, you're able to benefit from the visual aesthetic of an image time-lapse, while benefiting from the practicality of a video time-lapse. And that, my friends, is the lesser known time-lapse method.